say most of you won't have to go through what I went through in the last couple of weeks. It's pretty rare to have even 2 items happen that at the same time would keep a car from running. Well, I had 4 of them. Well, welcome to Budget Outlaws. Today I'm excited to try and start the 944 that sat for 20 years. It did briefly run 10 plus years ago when it was driven across town to a new storage place, and now we're trying to bring it back to life. I did the belts and rollers and water pump, and there's a link to that video down below in the description. I also did oil changes and filters and radiator hoses and refilled the coolant, changed the cap and roller, all those things that need to happen. Well, the first thing I did in the inspection video was to add oil to each cylinder through the spark plug hole. That was to prevent a dry startup. And as I did the oil change, I also primed the oil filter. I wanted to get as much oil down those galleries as possible. So I made a bit of a mess when I was doing the oil filter because it was pointed downwards instead of up. Either way, with the belt job done, it was ready to crank. I first did this with the spark plugs out so it would spin faster and prime the oil filter. I didn't initially get any oil pressure on the gauge, but sometimes it needs to fire to show anything. So I moved forward hoping that the pressure would pop up as soon as the engine fired. I replaced the spark plugs and the wires and did a triple check to see what else I might be missing. Now it's finally ready to start for the first time in a very long time. No joy. As you can hear, it's cranking over well, has decent compression. In other words, the belt job seems fine. And so it begins. We troubleshoot a no start problem. Well, one of my golden rules for car problems is what was most recently touched that you screwed up. Since I drained the 20-year-old fuel out of the tank, I started by seeing if the 2 gallons of fresh gas that I had added had filled up the fuel lines. There's a nut on the fuel rail for checking fuel pressure. I loosened it up, but I didn't need to check the pressure because there was no fuel in the rail. I decided to check to see if the pump was running. My initial checks didn't show any voltage at the pump. But knowing that the DME turns the pump off after a few seconds of priming, I decided to apply 12 volts directly to the pump to see if it ran. I pulled out the spare battery and gave positive and negative connections directly to the pump. It clicked, but nothing else. No spin as expected. Well, there's the problem. So I ordered a new fuel pump and waited a few days for it to arrive. I had other things to work on. When it came in, I bench tested it with the spare battery just like I did the old one. Yeah, it spins. So I installed it, spilling more gas than when I drained the gas the first time. Well, everything back together, cameras on, ready to start for the first time in a long time. Wah, nothing. I checked the fuel rail, still nothing. I couldn't hear the pump running. So I broke out the spare battery again and I applied 12 volts to the new pump directly. Yay, it works. I can hear fuel flowing through the whole system and returning back into the tank. I cracked open the nut on the fuel rail and yes, I have pressure. This is it. Camera's on. This is going to be a first start in a long time. Yeah, jumpering the fuel pump.
Here goes.
But you can see where this is going. Okay, so maybe I'm going out of turn on this, but the pump was really bad, honest. So I check what most people would check when they first start troubleshooting. Spark. I hooked up a remote starter so I could watch the test spark plug as I cranked with the key on. No spark. Honestly, it wasn't till now that I looked to see if the tach was bouncing slightly when cranking it over.
No tach.
Nope. So now I know as a 944 guy that the DME relay controls power to the DME as well as to the fuel pump.
2 standard leads.
So a quick internet search showed me how to build a jumper to bypass the DME relay. It uses 3 pins on the relay. I tried doing a 3-wire connect, but it was quite difficult to get the connectors on the fuse block underneath the dash. Well, another way to do this is to wrap wire around the pins on the relay and then plug it back into the slot. And there are a couple of ways to do this. One is to connect the 3 large spade connectors to each other. That uses the pin 30 as the power source, and which means with the relay plugged in, the power is always on. The other option is to use pin 86 as the power source, as that uses the 12 volt from the key as the power. Easier to deal with, but neither was a good long-term solution. Something I missed the first time around is that connecting power to pin 30 actually ran the fuel pump, but pin 86 did not. But still no start. So changing the DME, or jumpering the DME, pulling the relay out and doing a 3-way jumper, it got the fuel pump working, but it did not fire the engine. So then the test series says to check the for spark. We weren't getting any spark. We were, of course, getting gas up to the top now, and we were getting pressure at the test port here. So then we look at the reference, the speed and reference sensors. This is what's mounted on the back of the engine right underneath this spot right here. And the speed sensor checked bad. The ohm reading for the speed sensor checked bad. So I happen to have an extra pair that look ugly but actually do function. So this is, they're both the same. So this one has a bad plugs. So we will not use that one for now. But we only need one, so we'll change out the speed sensor with this spare and see if we can't get this thing to fire. Still no tack bounce, still no fuel pump without me applying 12 volt directly to the fuel pump, and still no spark. So I went around and checked everything all over again. This time I checked the speed and reference sensors directly at the DME plug, and I got the same readings. Plus I did a cranking test using 12 volts AC, and the readings fell within allowables. Well, I also received a new DME relay, and I installed it just in case I wasn't jumpering correctly. But no joy on that too. Someone suggested checking the grounds, and I'm all for that, so I looked them over and they were fine. Okay, so DMEs are expensive. I think I sold the last one I had for $50. Now they go for 200 plus. Well, I got lucky and found a used one on Facebook Marketplace, and the seller was willing to ship it for $100. It's a good deal these days. Thank you, Desiree.
Power always on.
Well, I should have listened to the guy on Rennbay. He said, "Do you have power to the DME?" Well, maybe I do, but if I did, it was when I had the DME relay jumpered.
Fuel pump was running.
The truth of the matter is that I didn't have the key on power to the DME relay in pin 86. So I didn't need to buy that DME. It made no difference. So I backed off and I scratched my head some more. The next day I had a pretty good idea what was wrong. It started with the speed sensor. I added a washer to the speed sensor when I installed it because that was on the old bracket. In reality, I didn't need them because the speed sensors were all the same size, and the old one didn't have a washer. So I removed it, put the speed sensor on without the washer. Of course I tried it, and it didn't fix the problem. But hang in there, we're getting close. Since I didn't have power to pin 86 on the DME relay, I made a jumper to get power from pin 30, which did have power. I did this before, but not with a speed sensor and the correct spacing for the flywheel. I pulled the number 1 plug with a jumper in place and checked for sparks. Hey, we have spark! I put number 1 back on and actually attempted to start the car for the first time in many years. Yeah. Nothing.
Got an adjustable mechanism.
But I was sure this was it. Then I remembered from someone else, either on Rennless or Pelican, that the injectors can freeze up after sitting for a long time, and tapping on them can cause them to start working again.
All right.
Well, this car certainly qualified, and what did I have to lose? So I got out my adjustable metric hammer and I started tapping on the injectors. And then I made another attempt at starting. This was actually the first time a cylinder had fired on this engine in over 10 years. Well, only one.
All right.
So I kept tapping. I got another one and another one. It actually ran. Wahoo! Still, it was only 2 or 3 cylinders that it was running on, and it idled around 200 RPM. But it ran. And that last injector was being stubborn. So I decided to take a break and see if good old YouTube could show me how to clean my injectors. Well, actually, it's pretty easy. I had an old wiring loom from my Jeep, and I spliced a couple of wires to it. Broke out the 12-volt battery. Some of the guys use 9-volt batteries. But I didn't have one in the shop, so I used the 12-volt. I used brake clean, even though they use carb cleaner. I rigged up one of those little spray nozzles with a couple of layers of shrink wrap to make sure it fit the intake of the injector. And I was ready to test. It took some handiwork to hold the nozzle from flying off under pressure, push the button on the brake clean, and attach 2 wires together. I'll show you my little gadget that I've made to make this a little bit easier. And spraying brake clean around the sparks really isn't a good idea. Well, I got out the injector that wasn't working, and I used my 3 hands and gave it a spray. Wow, it worked. I tapped the wires together to keep it from giving too much to the injector solenoid. I sprayed it some more and got a great pattern. This injector works. Actually, this was a little bit disappointing as I expected to have some issues. Anyway, I broke out the other 3 injectors and did the same. When I put them back on, I put them in different locations, swapping 3 and 4 and swapping 1 and 2. So if it was something in the computer or wiring that was causing them not to work, the problem cylinders would stay the same. Now, a note on this is a node light or a volt-ohm tester can be used to check for signals of the injectors. I didn't have a node, and I went the swap direction for troubleshooting. Okay, so I got it back together. Previously, it run on 2 or 3 cylinders, and I'm hoping for more. So I cranked it up, and bam, 4 cylinders. Wahoo! Yeah, the lifters are noisy. It's common for 944s to lose their lifter prime. They'll come back one at a time once it warms up and it's run a while. But it's running smoother. All 4 are hitting and it actually idles. Well, this is a great relief. But I'm not done yet. I'm still running on the jumper DME relay. So I killed the engine and swapped the DME relay for one without a jumper. Well, it went back to not running. And I kind of expected this. I didn't get a 12-volt signal in 86. So I needed to trace out the wiring from the key switch to the DME relay. But with a jumper, it runs. So what are the 4 things that kept it from running? And what's left?
It's basically...
Fuel pump was frozen. Would not spin. Replaced it with a new one. The speed sensor was open. The ohm rating should have been 600 to 1600 ohms. And it was open. The injectors were frozen up, and tapping on them freed them up. This probably caused more problem than anything. Without the jumper, and I had no power to the DME. The starter switch is very common for these early 944s. Yeehaw! Look for key on power at pin 86 on the DME relay plug on the fuse block. Also check for constant power at relay pin 30. This was fine on mine, but you need to check. Well, I pulled the computer out of the car so I could access the ignition switch plug. I pulled it down and determined that the large solid red wire was 12 volts coming from the battery. The striped large red wire was going to the starter. Then I started playing with a few of the other connectors. I could hear one of them sending juice to a relay on the fuse block, but I wasn't getting 12 volts at the computer plugs 18 and 35. And no matter what I did on any of the posts, I wasn't getting 12 volts to the DME relay. So I did what I had already tried several times, pull the fuse block assembly out and down so I could get to the back of it. Hallelujah! Pin 86 had come out of the back of the relay plug. This is it. Well, the little tab is broken on it to hold it in, so I'll have to replace that pin, or it'll just keep falling out. But I was able to plug in the relay, pressing the wire in from the back. I did a couple quick jumpers and pressed my starter button, and bam, it worked. Well, it was a challenge, and who knows if I was the one who pushed it out the back or not. In theory, any of those 3 other items could have kept it from running, and I just made it worse when I was checking things. But it's all about testing, trial and error, then backing up and doing it again and again and again. Well, I'm very happy to get this car running. My wife is getting worried. Like I said at the opening, it's rare to run into this many issues at the same time. Many times it's the last thing you touched, and in this case, it kind of bit me as I worked against myself troubleshooting this no start. Well, how should I have done it? Well, check to see if the fuel pump runs when you turn the key on. It should for a couple seconds. Check to see if there's spark. Put a screwdriver in a remove spark plug lead and hold it about 1/4 inch from ground. Then have a friend check it over to see if it shows a spark. If you're missing one or the other, or both, swap out the DME relay. Yes, you should have a spare in your glove box. Get one if you don't. Maybe invest in a little newly designed solid-state relay. Or try the jumper thing. Check for constant voltage at 30. With the key on, you should have voltage at 86. Check for ohms on the speed and reference sensors. Unplug them and check for resistance. Still nothing? Pull a plug. Is it wet, oily, not going to start? Check the others. Replace if necessary. But something else is wrong if this is happening. Hey, check your grounds. There was a guy on Rennbay's forums that used to practically scream this at other people troubleshooting their car. If everything checks out, but it still doesn't have spark or fuel pump, then you need to start checking the pins on the DME for correct voltages and other readings. There's a troubleshooting document that I'll put in the link in the description. There are other things to check as well. Fuel pressure. Is there enough? Is it bleeding off? Are you out of gas? Is the gas old? I know that one. Is the fuel pump working properly, providing enough pressure? Is the coil working? Is the cap and rotor okay? Are the spark plug wires old and shorting or providing too much resistance? Are the timing belts okay? Is there compression? Well, I wish you the best of luck in getting your car running. If you have a 944 or even some other car, the procedures are different, but the theory is the same for most cars. Thanks for staying with me on this long video. There's no shortcuts in troubleshooting. Leave me a note if you have questions or comments. Check out the other videos. Like, subscribe, click the bell. Hey, we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.